Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see that folks are coming in. We give it a little bit more to have folks come on in. But welcome to the E.H.Zero series webinar titled Building Performance Standards, a Win-Win Scenario. You may have been at the one 2 weeks ago when we talked about transparency, and we have a few coming up after this. It'll be deep diving into transparency regarding a point of sale and point of lease, um, renewable electricity for large commercial buildings, and what is zero code. If y'all were able to be in the last couple webinars, you saw that we have been talking about this because of the Zero Cities project, which came out with best policies and practices and programs of how to enable our built environment to get to zero carbon. I want to thank our speakers, Tara Brown, Manager of the City Solutions for IMT, Ben Rabe, Project Manager at NBI, and Katie Bergfeld, Branch Chief at the DOE, for speaking with us today. So the E.H.Zero project could not be done without the partners involved with this. The City of Grand Rapids, 23rd District, which is myself, and the Urban Core Collective. And thank you to the Wiki Foundation and the Kresge Foundation for supporting this work. And also the visionary sponsors at DTE, Consumers Energy, and Eagle of Michigan. So the agenda today will be that Tara Brown will speak deeply onto what BPS is, and we'll transition it to Ben and Katie's stories for how BPS has worked for their respective cities, followed by Q&A. And before we get started, I just want to do some housekeeping real quick. You know that the chat can be either to everybody or just the panelists, as well as the Q&A is available for you to submit your questions with your name or anonymously. And we encourage you to ask as many questions as you want, create comments, get involved. We're very curious. Actually, introduce yourselves in the chat right now. We'd love to see who's here. If there's any particular questions for us, we'll be able to share how to get a hold of us at the end of this. And there'll be a robust Q&A to have an open dialogue with you folks. But without further ado, I'd love to send it over to Tara Brown to get us started for today.
Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be with you here today to share what we've learned about building performance standards and across the nation and why it is a policy cities are using to help advance building decarbonization as well as supporting the communities and allowing them to thrive. First off, I'd like to introduce my organization. If you haven't heard of us before, we are called IMT. It used to be known as Institute for Market Transformation. And we believe that it is imperative that we catalyze widespread and sustained demand for high-performing buildings. Waste is not something we want to promote, energy efficiency is. And we do this by advancing policies and business practices that enable people to build and operate healthy, high-performing buildings. So in our team of 30, we have experts from the design world, from the built world, from the energy efficiency world, those that have practiced in the utility space, community engagement coordinators previously, and like myself from cities. Previous to this role, I served in a city, and previous to that, I was in corporate sustainability. So we bring a wide experience to this work as we help cities and stakeholders advance practices and policies. Now, cities and counties and states, I'll focus more on cities today, but there are different ways that buildings can be regulated. They are regulated at the design and construction phase with codes, and then when they're being operated. And that's what I want to focus on today, the operation of buildings. Code is important, but we have much more buildings being operated than we do being built. And so that's why there is a case for focusing on the building performance or operation of a building. We know that when people live in buildings, they are exposed to health risks. Unfortunately, in some buildings, they have a poorer air quality indoors than outside. And buildings do waste energy and they are a source of emissions. So it's really important that we focus on how to make those higher performing. And I have a few facts here. If post this presentation, I am happy to share where we got these from. But in 2024, in 2040, 2/3 of the buildings that exist today will still exist in the future. And right now, the current pace of major improvements across the nation is 2% of commercial buildings a year and 0.5% of residential buildings. And when you think about the goals that your community has around emission reduction, and if buildings are the largest share of that, we aren't going to meet our emission reduction and waste reduction goals at the current rate that buildings are retrofitted and performing at a better level. So what we've seen happen, first evolution of supporting buildings and becoming more energy efficient was benchmarking and transparency policies. There are now over 43 of these policies across the nation at varying levels of government. I know of 2 other cities that will be passing an ordinance like this in the next month, as well as 3 other cities that are working with stakeholders to write the best policy that fits their local needs. And really where this started was with benchmarking. It's really helping the building owners benchmark their own facilities. If we have building owners online or the property managers and operators, likely many of you are benchmarking yourselves. And where the benchmarking and transparency policies take it a step further is it's asking all buildings above a certain size threshold and building use type to do this diagnostic check, understand how their energy is being used compared to others. And it's actually sharing that with the government so they can look at an aggregate building whole to understand how do they better allocate funds and resources to support waste energy reduction in the buildings. And then they make it transparent so the market can use this information in the right way to reward those that are highly efficient, give those tenants that care about this, because there is a small amount of tenants that do care about this, giving them that information to make informed decisions. And we've seen success with these types of building policies. Here are a couple of examples of cities that have instituted building benchmarking and transparency policies and seen great reduction over the first few years that they're reported. But again, the challenge is getting to the emission reduction that we really need to see. And this is from another Midwest city where they passed a building performance policy in the last few years. And they recognize, while it's going to make an impact because building owners will look at their scores, determine action, it's not going to be a large enough impact to meet a lot of the 2050 goals, 2030 and 2040 goals that are out there. So they're looking for other ways to help incent or request that buildings make changes and help decarbonize. And there are different ways to do that. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of these, but here are just a few other examples of how they're doing that is through electrification policies. Here is an example of the timeline Denver has to help transition the electrification of their buildings. Again, these slides will be available later, so I don't want to get into the detail of it, but you can, if you really want to get it, look at it and review it, we'll have those available for you in the future. Another way that cities have gone ahead and required less waste in buildings is a prescriptive way. And so we've seen audits and retuning built upon benchmarking transparency to mandate a certain way to ensure that they're really going beyond just the numbers and looking inside their building to say what needs to be updated, doing that walkthrough to see what can be done. There's a great opportunity to have waste energy reduction, but at the end of the day, you aren't going to be able to calculate what that waste energy reduction is. And it's similar to benchmarking and transparency, where an audit you're given what could be updated, but it isn't to say that those things will be updated. And so that's where cities and counties and states are starting to look at building performance standards. So when I talk, a lot of people use building BPS, building performance standards, in different ways. So I want to share with you the context of how I'm looking at that and how IMT talks about it. Building performance standards establish targets for buildings to reduce energy use or their greenhouse gas emissions. Some of them may do both. Over the long-term time frame, these performance standards have intermediate reporting compliance periods, and they require all buildings to hit a final defined target. And I want to point out, we'll get into it in the nuance, but I know some people's minds are going straight there. When we say these long-term targets for all buildings, it doesn't mean all buildings will have the same target. And Katie will get into how they've worked with this in DC. I'll share a little bit of, it's really working with your stakeholders to understand the nuances of how those buildings are used to set the right targets for the building type and building uses that you have. And here are just a host of values and outcomes that we see with building performance standards. They require improvements on a wide range of buildings. We're not focused on just retail or just office, but looking at the whole building stock, determining which building types and uses you want to use. The biggest opportunity we see is we're seeing retrofits at a deeper scale because we have these long-term targets. So instead of just when a roofing update comes in and you just replace the roof, knowing that you have these future targets, some buildings have chosen to look at of what would it take to add an additional layer or bolster my insulation on my roofing per se, since I have to make sure that my building's performing better at a future date. I took that example because that's what I did with the city hall that I worked in previous to this role. It also provides great value in the market and creating and investing in private buildings. Again, we're going to need some new financing tools. Some buildings are going to be able to perform to these levels with the current financing tools that they have. And through stakeholder meeting and engagement, we understand that there are other financing tools that need to be brought to the market to help with these deeper retrofits. What I love too is that the building performance provide comprehensive approach to performance. So instead of making a prescriptive approach, your building might be a little bit more nuanced than another building with the same type or use. So this performance says, what is the future need? And you can work within your building, within your tenants, how the building users operate to determine how best to make that energy efficiency work for you. Lastly, kind of paired with that, it allows this flexibility with those long-term goals. Like maybe you have immediate action now because you're replacing your HVAC system, or maybe that's still 15 years out for you. So having these long-term goals allow buildings to make the right adjustments on their asset timelines and replacements. So we're starting to see a growth in building in cities and communities, stakeholders engaging in what should a building performance standard look like for their community. Here is the current building performance standards that have passed. There are others talking about a building performance standard or what could support one. And so Grand Rapids is one of over 30 communities that have signed up to the White House's National Building Performance Standard Coalition. And this is an exciting way for these multiple coalitions over the next 2 years, learn from one another, collaborate, get the information needed to inform local policy that's going to make the best impact in their communities. And I really love your mayor's commitment to this and what she spoke to. So I just wanted to read this out for you in case this recording happens, that the city of Grand Rapids recognizes that decarbonizing our buildings is one of the most critical pathways to achieving community-wide net zero carbon emissions. In 2021, we launched the Equitable, Healthy, and Zero Carbons Building Initiative, which built upon the successful equity focused on the foundation that we built with our community based on partners over the last several years through the National Cities Project. It is critical that equity be a dual priority embedded into the building performance standard and other high-performing building programs. So equity, you hear that word a lot, and I wanted to kind of step into that because I've talked a lot about the goals and the focus on reducing energy waste and meeting emission goals for climate change. But equity is another thing that we see communities are asking city policy to focus on. And this is taken from the American Cities Climate Challenge report, Building Performance Standards, a new way for equitable policies to address existing buildings. And what this is showing is, yes, we need to focus on buildings because they are large emitters and there is waste that we can reduce. But we also know that the outcomes in the health of these buildings, what they look like, they are disparate. And so the outcomes of a high performing building shouldn't, and whether your health is tied to that high performing building, shouldn't be based on or determined by race either. So this is one thing that the coalition is working on, is sharing ways that they center frontline and fence line communities in understanding what are the needs, problems, and goals that those communities need to thrive in the building space as they use buildings, as they work in buildings. And when you center that and start with those types of goals, it provides a building performance standard that's going to actually help the community thrive. This is also from that same toolkit. And this is a common process that a city takes when developing a new policy. And so I just wanted to walk you through this. So you have this context when I talk deeper about what a building performance standard looks like. So you can think of, you're likely some type of stakeholder that will be involved in this work. And then this might help you think through, where might you interject? What skills do you have? What experience or knowledge do you have? And how might you bring that to the table as your community discusses what a building performance standard looks like? So at the first level, there's going to be preparation, right, before there's actually policy making, like any good project or program. You're going to need to gather, establish what those goals are. And like I said, many cities are taking those goals from their current climate action plans and then also going out and doing community engagement to understand what else does the community need to make sure you have those twin goals. So you might not see policy start to be made for another 6 months to a year if you're first starting with community engagement, because community engagement can take quite a long time if the city already doesn't have those relationships and hasn't been reaching out and doing the listening. If the city started that listening, this community engagement and the relationships are strong, community engagement might only take 3 months or 6 months. So it's really dependent on your community. Based off of that, based off of what you know, how what the city has relationships in, where the gaps are, they're going to develop a stakeholder engagement plan. And they're going to also be collecting more information on the building stock and the community concerns. So if a lot of your community says air quality is a real issue, or in a city I'm working in right now with their community engagement and their community-based organizations are sharing, energy burden is a really hard part for part of our frontline communities. Their bills are too high. So that is a community concern that that city is bringing into their goals, is how do we help reduce energy burden? And when you pair that with the building stock, you might find you're looking at buildings that are different than previous policies you've had. And then lastly, identifying the different ways you want to measure success and bringing those options to the next step, which is policy making. And so this is where the city will lead kind of the nuts and bolts of design. They're going to address the considerations related to funding, staffing, data, tenants, and they're going to develop communications and a political strategy to ensure that everyone is informed. This process is transparent so it can be taken to council with the community input. How this is done, so those are kind of what is done. How is done is going to vary by city, but the majority of cities have used some type of task force, commission, or committee that has a broad swath of stakeholders with varying experience to come together and work through this policy development. And once they've created a draft, either another committee might approve that draft, might change it, and then there's usually time for a public open comment. So I just want to be clear that I haven't seen a community or a city do this behind closed doors. And the way the coalition is set up and what I've heard from different cities is this is a transparent process. Katie can speak to her transparent process, where stakeholders are really encouraged and given, and the draft is always published for public viewing when the right time comes. So there's multiple steps in the process for stakeholders to be engaged. Lastly, it comes time, if the policy is presented, it is passed by council, it has the community input in it, then it comes time to implementation. And that's the heavy lifting where the rubber hits the road, right? So this is where stakeholder engagement is set up to ensure that the right resources are out there to help ensure that buildings can meet the policy, because at the end of the day, the goal is to have a high rate of compliance. And then, of course, they're going to go into building out programs. Katie's group has done a great job of building out many different programs. She'll speak to that as an example, and establish supportive tools and resources for those who need it most. So I'd like to get into the meat of like, what is a BPS? And I wanted to share a couple examples with you. So here is one type of building performance standard that cities have approved. And this type of standard, they are allowing the metrics to be recalculated every 4 to 5 years with those stakeholders. So they have a governing body that's made up of experts from that locality to inform how those standards are going to be updated over the future years. We're also seeing cities go ahead and set a long-term standard for where their greenhouse gas emissions are going to be. And which metric is chosen really varies off of what the city has the capability and authority to put legislation to. It also matters, what are their goals? Are their climate action plan goals set around an emission reduction, or are they set around an efficiency optimization? So those are also going to matter in which of these a community chooses. And I will say, it's not just one part, it's very nuanced. There are many things going into this. So there isn't a direct line to say, if you have a net zero plan, it's going to be an emission based. So it's what they have the authority on, where are their goals. Also, how is it important in how the building owners understand this information and what they can act on? So that might be another reason why some cities choose a trajectory approach and focus on EUI, if that's maybe what their community is really focused on, and their current stakeholders really understand energy use intensity. So a direct trajectory approach is one way to do this as well. I'm not going to dig into the other two. Katie's here to share hers, and you saw that on the first slide. IMT, I am only one organization. I want to call that out. And we believe in this trajectory approach for a few reasons, and I want to walk through those and share with you. And this is an approach that other cities are starting to take because it really allows the buildings to start where they're at, but still get to the same goal. So this example here is if we had 3 different office buildings that had different energy use intensities based off of what's being operated in their building, Again, any kind of building performance standard, setting those goals out in the future. This one says, how do we go out? It's usually 10 to 15 years out and set interim targets in between. And this allows, again, that building that might have a higher energy use to take time to ratchet down, instead of asking them to reduce their energy use by, maybe if the full goal is reduce your energy by 30%, and that first goal is 20%, it's going to be a lot harder for building C to do that, maybe if they've already have high energy efficiency. So instead of saying they have to have a hit an ultimate reduction, it's showing what the performance is in the long term. And by setting a goal for everyone to hit a performance in the long term, each building again can work on their own time. And I just, again, want to say the metrics might be different for your community, but that trajectory approach would be the same if it's for energy use or if it's for on-site thermal or greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a model ordinance out there that talks through what that could actually look like for a city and community. Again, this is taken from many different cities' inputs. This, we've asked BOMA, we've asked many different other ASHRAE, many other associations to comment on this policy. So this isn't something that we've created in a vacuum, but taking many different stakeholders' inputs to understand the best kind of model ordinance to set out there, as many of these national organizations would like to, they recognize that there are local needs, but the more that we can keep ordinances, the nuance and the policy writing the same across localities, the easier it is for groups that work in many different localities to execute against these standards. So that is one thing that stakeholders are always balancing, those locality needs with also how to make this comparable to where many of your businesses might be operating. Ann Arbor is another Michigan city that is signed up for the BPS Coalition. So it's maybe recognizing what policies are they creating. And if you have a heavy overlap in your stakeholders and your building owners, it's maybe sharing that information to ensure that your policies are written in a way that aren't contradicting, but complementary to support those building owners in taking action. Here is an example of, but what happens, I know some of you are jumping to like, that looks great, a straight line, but that's not how we update our policies, right? And that's not how assets are updated in this straight line. So there's always going to be a need for exemptions. And that's one thing that as I've written policy in the past, I assure you, policy writers know when they engage stakeholders, there are always exceptions to the rules, and we have to write those in to make sure that this policy can be implemented by everyone. So here's an example of maybe one of those buildings that have a high energy use. They're going to have to get to a lower energy use than maybe another building. And so here they are on this timeline mapping out, well, what are our asset replacements that we're going to be doing? And let's see if you can follow mine. So maybe that, right, we all know lighting creates a great reduction up front, but maybe here in that first interim standard, we're hitting that goal. But in the next interim standard, we don't have, this building doesn't have any replacements coming up before that interim standard is. So this is maybe where they might ask for an exception. It's like, hey, I know 2026 is when I'm supposed to hit this number here, but I have a huge envelope upgrade coming in 2027 or 28. Can I ask for an exception, this interim one, knowing that I'm committing to this asset upgrade in my building in the next few years? So that is an exemption that someone might seek or need to make sure that the building can go on its own time, realize the full assets it has today while capturing the savings of tomorrow. And so that's one reason why many cities work towards an exemption. One example of an exemption, again, your locality is going to write what's best for your stakeholders with that stakeholder input, but we're calling these like a building performance action plan. And so this is a method by which this can be written in, right? Not just a image, but putting down on paper, putting words on paper, what's actually going to happen. How are they going to still meet that long-term goal, even if they can't maybe meet an interim goal? And usually we're seeing what's acceptable is maybe writing these every 5 years if your standards are set for every 5-year upgrade, right? These aren't going to be an annual thing that happens because the city, these policies take a lot to manage. And you as building owners know you're not going to want to update a plan every year, but how do you create a long-term plan, set that and work towards it and have that time and space to work towards it? So another thing that we have to think about is I talked about implementation. Once that policy is written, standards are set, how is a building going to get towards these? And that's why a lot of conversations in this policy development also talk about what are those turnkey support programs. So if we're setting certain goals, what challenges are building owners going to have in meeting these energy efficiency or carbon reduction goals? And so we know that most of these building performance standards focus on a goal of deep retrofit and really provide necessary compliance, right? We want to make sure that there's high compliance with this. So those support programs have to happen. And this can come in technical assistance, whether it's audits maybe that start with free audits or a help desk. We know that financial capital is a major opportunity to help with these deep retrofits. And ideally, again, what other kind of programs or compliance things need to be written in to help with this? We also know that when it comes time for implementation, workforce is another major part of it. Is your workforce ready to help with deep retrofits? Are they skilled to do something beyond just the lighting upgrade, help you with that building automation system? So workforce and economic inclusion is another focus that cities and stakeholders talk about to ensure they have the right programs in place to scale up that type of need. And so before I hand this off, I just want to kind of give you ideas of where you can help. So for those that are part of a community, you can advocate, you can bring your expertise to the table, and you can support implementation. So with advocacy, help tell the case, because there's always a lot of fear when change comes or policy writing. So I really encourage people to come to the table and say, yeah, this is possible. We might not be able to do a moonshot, but updates, and this is technically achievable here. Let's showcase some leaders and how they've done it. Really making the case for economic benefits. I think a lot of you here always, right, you're working for profit companies. You have to make these economic benefits pencil out. The community is going to speak up to those health benefits. And it's really important for you to hear those and then also see how those work. We've seen building standards, not building performance, but other building policies and standards come out of places with high asthma rates, recognizing that creating better air quality indoors is going to help with those asthma rates. And so taking those health advisors, those health experts, and helping calculate the economic benefit to better air quality equals less emergency room visits equals less time here. There is an economic value to increasing the health benefit of these. So those are the type of examples that I'm talking about. And then, like I said, there's always going to be fear of change. So recognize that in yourself, but also say something's possible and I want to come to the table to help. And then I will say there is a lot of expertise that's needed at this table. And there are many papers published nationally, there are papers and universities published locally, and it's really important to have that local expertise at the table saying what has worked, what hasn't, what are those challenges. So then when it comes time to support the industry, those successes and failures are known, and that solutions are put around those failures of the past to ensure there aren't unintended consequences for the future. Here's my contact information. I am always happy to answer more questions if you have those, or send those on to my experts that work in this day-to-day. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Ben Rabe, who is the project manager for New Buildings Institute. And I've known Ben professionally before. He worked at New Buildings Institute here in the Twin Cities region as he worked with St. Paul to advance building policy as his role in Fresh Energy. So Ben, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Tara. Just get my screen shared here. Can folks see my screen? All right, thanks, Tara. So today I'm going to talk about a different option that's not technically a building performance standard, but more of a carrot approach that the city of St. Paul has been using for over a decade. So thanks so much. Here we go. All right, I think Tara covered this very well, but just to reiterate that if the United States buildings were its own country, it would be the third largest energy user in the world. So just to frame things, that US buildings alone consume more energy than Russia. All right, so St. Paul is in a bit of a unique situation in that state law here in Minnesota prohibits cities from having a stronger building code requirement than the state itself. So we have a minimum max building code. So there needs to be some sort of incentive attached to the ability to kind of hold buildings to a higher standard. So in 2010, St. Paul adopted a sustainable building policy that's attached to incentive of over $200,000 of any sort of public money, and applies to all new and renovated city buildings. So it captures a lot of buildings. It's not as all-encompassing as a true building performance standard. And it's based on a similar state policy that's required for state bonded buildings. All right, so the ordinance has two pieces. Buildings receiving that money must comply with a green building standard that I'll get into a little bit more next, and comply with an overlay, which is just to kind of make sure that whatever performance standard that they do adhere to, that they kind of capture all the pieces that the city wants to look at. So in doing that, the city was able to cast a fairly wide net in which standards folks could adhere to. So some of these obviously are Minnesota specific, and some that like LEED is that you'd recognize kind of more nationwide or global standards. And the St. Paul overlay includes energy, potable water, stormwater management, diversion of construction materials to landfills, and indoor air quality. So specifically related to energy, that buildings are required to step down over time. So you can see that when this policy was implemented, they were used half of a typical building and then stepped down by 10% to net zero energy by 2030. So we're, in the 2020 to 2025 range, we are getting pretty close to net zero already. All right, so there's some additions coming soon to the St. Paul building policy, including cost-effective renewable energy, vehicle charging, and electric vehicle ready charging capabilities, as well as other resiliency options that are still being kind of flushed out to what extent they're available. All right, so as I mentioned, this program's been around since 2010. So since then, 70 projects or nearly 70 projects have been completed. Over 3 million square feet of building space, covering, wow, a lot. 564 million, so over half a billion of development costs, and has covered everything from single family to multifamily, commercial, big venues that folks in the Twin Cities would be familiar, like the Ordway and CHS Field, which is where the minor league baseball team plays, which is featured above. Community centers, museums, pretty much any sort of kind of public community space. And to the equity piece that I know is being discussed in the chat and earlier is that it's covered a lot of affordable housing developments because those are receiving public pots of money. And a really exciting project that's under works that will all be compliant with this standard is the Highland Bridge project that I always want to call the Ford site because it's on a former automotive manufacturing plant that was in the heart of St. Paul. So right kind of on the river, in a very, very urban part of the city. So it provides a very unique opportunity of 120 acres of urban land that has not been developed. So the way that the city has interpreted the building policy for this project is that the city's going to build all the infrastructure, which will amount to way more than that $200,000 threshold. So all buildings will need to meet that standard, and depending whether they're built before or after 2025 is whether they meet the 80% or 90% energy reduction toward net zero compared to other spaces. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Katie, and obviously we'll be available for questions. So yeah, Katie Bergfeld is a branch chief for building performance with Washington, DC.
There we go. Hi, everyone. You can see my slides, right? Okay, good. Hi, yeah, so my name is Katie Bergfeld. I'm the branch chief for building performance and enforcement in the Energy Administration at the Department of Energy and Environment. I work for the government of the District of Columbia, so the local government in DC, not the federal government. It gets confusing sometimes for people. And I'm actually originally from a small town outside St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm a Midwesterner myself. And so, yeah. So I'm going to be here to sort of provide a case study of how we call them building energy performance standards in DC, because ours is an energy efficiency metric currently. So BPS or BEPS, as we call it here in the district. And sort of just a case study of how things developed in DC. And I'm going to give some background on our policy. I'm going to try to not go into too much detail, but I do have slides with detail on it so that you all can access that later. And I tried to provide a lot of links to websites so you can check some things out afterwards. But just to sort of set the context of the goals we have here in the district, we all operate under what we call the Sustainable DC vision, which is to make DC the healthiest, greenest, and most livable city in the country for all district residents. And so this was a vision that was set forth in 2012 by the previous mayoral administration, and we've carried forth that vision with our current administration. And sort of what that looks like is Sustainable DC has several goals within it. The ones that are, and they range from water efficiency to land use to energy usage. So the ones that are most germane to the conversation today are the fact that we have the goal to cut citywide energy usage by 50% by 2032, to increase the use of renewables to 50% by 2032, and then to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2032. And then somewhat recently, about 5 years ago, our Mayor Bowser committed to making us carbon neutral by 2050. So Sustainable DC is just a set of goals that we are attempting to achieve. Our climate action plan, which I will talk a bit about today, because that was sort of the basis of how our BPS came about, is called Clean Energy DC. And so the way I like to describe, government people like to have a lot of plans. The way that I like to describe the distinction between sustainable DC and clean energy DC is that sustainable DC is sort of the what, like what are we trying to achieve? We are trying to achieve a 50% greenhouse gas emission reduction. Clean energy DC is how. So how are we going to do that? And so Clean Energy DC is a plan that we released in its final form in 2018. It lays out 57 policy action items of how we will get to that 50% reduction. And it basically models out if you implement these policy action items, you'll get to that 50% reduction. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is just a quick screenshot of some charts from Clean Energy DC. So again, this was released in 2018. The estimated total savings based on those 57 action items is about a 56% reduction. And you can see the relative impact of the different types of actions within that plan. So buildings, energy supply, and transportation. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see that a large portion of the reductions are going to come from the efficiency of our existing buildings. So improving the efficiency of our existing buildings is going to make up nearly a quarter of the reductions that we're going to see. And the reason for that, you can see at the bottom, is that buildings are about 75%, they make up about 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions here in the district. So in order for us to achieve our goals, we have to address the efficiency of our buildings. And this is something that we've known for a very long time. And it goes very far back. I'll talk about sort of where we started in terms of getting there. But coming out of the Clean Energy DC plan, DC Council then passed a law in 2018, around the same time we released the plan, sort of codifying, making all of this law. And not all of it, but pieces of the Clean Energy DC plan are now law. Like they are the law of the lands here in DC. And two of the things that the legislation did that I'll talk about today is they lowered the threshold of buildings that have to benchmark or report their data to the district. And then it created the first of its kind in the nation Building Energy Performance Standards program. So these requirements, we were the first in the country to pass this. We are also the first in the country to have a benchmarking law. So we have sort of a history of pushing these policies forward here in the district. So taking a step back a little bit, the BEPS program is built off of our benchmarking program, our benchmarking requirements, which were set forth in 2008 through the Clean and Affordable Energy Act. For many years, the benchmarking reporting requirements applied to buildings over 50,000 square feet. Now that is dropping down to 25,000 square feet this year. And then in 3 years, it will drop down to 10,000 square feet for privately owned buildings. District-owned buildings have had to benchmark from the 10,000 square foot threshold and up since 2010. So we have collected a lot of data on these buildings. All of it is done through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and then we publicly disclose that information. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is our website where we publicly disclose all that information. And I provided a link at the bottom. You all can go check it out. You can see, I think we have data going all the way back to 2012 for some of the largest buildings. So you can scroll through the buildings. You can see sort of how they're performing compared to others. We also have a building scorecard built out for each building. So you can open it up and see sort of the impact of that building compared to others. So then that takes us now to sort of the current time. So we've been collecting this data for years and years and years. And then Council passed a law called the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act, which requires DOE to set a minimum threshold of energy performance that is no lower than the local median Energy Star score by property type. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Energy Star score, but it's basically a 1 to 100 score. It's a model that is built out by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And it basically allows buildings to sort of see on a scale of 1 to 100 how efficient their building is performing compared to buildings of a similar type. So basically, in practical terms, we took all the office buildings in the district and we saw sort of what was that median Energy Star score for all those office buildings. And then we said, you must be performing at that level. Specifically, the Building Energy Performance Standards for offices is the Energy Star score of 71. So any buildings that hit that 71 or above, you're good. Any buildings that don't hit that 71, I'll talk in a minute what they're going to be required to do. And then Council also requires that we reset the standards every 6 years. So we set the first standard January 1st, 2021, and then every 6 years, we are to set a new standard. This will ratchet down in square footage. So for this first BEPS period, which is that first period after we set the standard, it applies to privately owned buildings over 50,000 square feet. When we get to the next 6-year period, it will drop down to 25,000 square feet. And then when we get to the next 6-year period, it will drop down to 10,000 square feet. This slide just explains the metrics that are relevant to our program. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but just know that basically we use the Energy Star score to bifurcate the building stock. And so we say, here's the Energy Star score. If you are above it, then you don't really have to do anything right now. If you are below it, you do have to do something. And that something is reducing the energy that you consume on site by a certain percentage, essentially. To show what that looks like from a practical matter is the owner benchmarks their building, they report that data to the district. We then establish those standards. Then we look at each building and we say, did your building meet that standard? The building meets a standard, you're good. We'll see you in 6 years, basically. That building does not meet the standard, they're put on what we call a compliance cycle. And so that compliance cycle is established in the legislation as a 5-year period by which buildings have to reduce their site energy use intensity by about 20%. So they have to, from the year 1, we look at a baseline of their site energy use intensity, which is their energy use per square foot. And then we compare it to year 5 and we see if there was a 20% reduction. Because of COVID, so we were trying to stand up this program as COVID was happening. We basically extended the first compliance cycle by 1 year. So buildings are now being given 6 years to meet that 20% reduction. Again, we set the first standard January 1st, 2021. So our standards have already been established. They were published last year. So we're already about a year into the compliance cycle. That's basically where we're at right now. And then, like I said, buildings sort of have that 5 to 6 year period to make those reductions. These are the different pathways that are available to building owners. Tara mentioned that, there are ways that you can build out a prescriptive pathway for building owners. We were required by law to do that. So we did that. So the main pathways that are spelled out in the legislation are a performance pathway, which again is to reduce your site energy use intensity by 20% over a 5-year period. It provides maximum flexibility to the building owner because it literally just says, we're going to look at your data in year 1, we're going to look at your data in year 5, and we're going to see, was there a 20% reduction? And you can do it however you want. The prescriptive pathway is more action-based. So we built out a set of actions and a process that a building owner has to follow that will get them savings comparable to a 20% reduction. So that's something that DOE built out ourselves. And the interesting thing that what we've done with that pathway now is we've said, we have this prescriptive pathway. We did a lot of work to make sure that it's not a loophole, right? Because we don't want people to say, oh, well, I'll just check these boxes and I'm good, right? So we had to do a lot of work to ensure that it's not a loophole that gets them out of getting a 20% reduction. And then the other thing that we tell people is, even if you're not following the prescriptive pathway, this is sort of our set of best practices of how to do a building upgrade and meet and get a 20% reduction. So that's sort of what's been helpful with that pathway. And then Tara mentioned the idea of providing other flexibilities, and we've sort of done that through what we are calling alternative compliance pathways. So we have several alternative compliance pathways that we've pre-approved on our end, and I'm not going to get into detail on those right now, but I can if anyone has questions. But as Tara mentioned with the building performance action plan, I believe, we have what we're calling a custom ACP process. So building owners can come to us and say, the other pathways don't work for us for some reason, or we have some innovative way that we want to try to comply. And we want you to create a custom alternative compliance pathway for us. And they would apply, we would have to approve that, the pathway, and it would become an agreement between us and the building owner that that's how they're going to comply. This just gives a picture of what it all looks like overall in a 6-year period. So building owners are benchmarking their building. You can see at the bottom every year. So they're going to continue to have to do that. That is a requirement. That does not stop because of BEPS. The legislation also requires the building owners have to get their data third-party verified every 3 years, so we can ensure that that self-reported data is actually accurate. Since that is a big piece of what this program is built off of, right, is that data. And then buildings that don't meet the BEPS are put on these 5-year compliance cycles. Then there's sort of a year buffer for us to do data analysis and enforcement. And then we reset the BEPS. I forgot to mention the enforcement piece. So building owners that do not meet the target of their pathway are going to be subject to penalties of up to $10 per square foot. So we're talking pretty hefty penalties. And so that's sort of the basis of our program, just to give you a sense of some of the things we've done to help support building owners along the way. So, we established our regulations. They were finalized in November. There was a very long process for us to work with our stakeholders and figure out, how is this program actually going to be implemented and enforced? And what flexibilities do we need to build in? What considerations do we need to make? We established the first standard on January 1st, 2021, as I mentioned. We also updated our benchmarking regulations because we realized there were some things in our regulations for benchmarking that didn't quite align with how we need people to comply with the BPS. So we had to sort of take a look at that and figure that out. We have a BEPS compliance and enforcement guidebook, which gives a very detailed explanation of how we sort of interpret those regulations. Like, this is what we mean when we say go get a level 2 ash rate audit, right? This is what we mean. This is what we're going to be looking for when you submit that documentation to us, right? We did a cost benefit analysis. This was also required by the legislation. So we did a cost benefit analysis, which sort of looks at the total cost of complying with our BPS. And it models out 13 different building typologies and sort of shows different packages of how those buildings could meet a 20% reduction and what the return on investment are for those different measures, the savings to investment ratio for each of those measures, and then sort of the total average cost to comply. And that's sort of where we came up with our $10 per square foot, to be honest, penalty. We also have some technical support tools that I mentioned at the bottom of this slide. All of it can be found on what we call our knowledge base, and I've provided a link there. This is another thing that we stood up in the last year to help building owners. It is a repository of information for all of our programs. There's the ability to submit tickets to us, to ask us questions. We provide a lot of compliance assistance. Our help center is actually run in-house, which a lot of other cities don't do that. So we run our help center in-house. And we also have stood up what we're calling a building owner portal, where building owners will have their own individual login to be able to go in and track their compliance with the benchmarking and the BEPS requirements. That was recently launched. And then this slide right here just gives you a sense of all the outreach and engagement that we have done for this program. And I can talk about these, more in detail, but this just gives you a sense sort of all the way back to August of 2018, when the Clean Energy DC plan was published. We were doing public engagement before that plan was even published. That was part of publishing that plan. So we've been doing, public engagement on these sort of policies for a very long time. We issued building performance scorecards to building owners. We held working group sessions in the summer of 2019, and we basically just posed the question to the participants and said, what kind of scares you the most about this, right? What do you think the biggest challenges are to trying to do this? And then what we did after that was we broke out into 4 different sessions based on the grouping of challenges that people were bringing up. So we had a session on financing. Then we had a session on setting the metrics, right? And then we had a session on how do we determine the different building typologies that we're going to set out. So that's sort of where we are with that. We also established a building innovation hub. So we established them to help building owners understand all of these policies and kind of move with us as we're trying to move towards a carbon neutral and net zero buildings here in the district. And then the last big group of stakeholders that I want to touch on is our Building Energy Performance Standards Task Force. So this was also established in the legislation that we have a 17-member task force. That's Mayor Bowser right in the middle. 17-member task force made up of 5 public sector members and 12 private sector members, representing building owners, service providers, nonprofit advocacy organizations, to sort of guide us as we're implementing this program. And we started meeting with the task force in December of 2019, bi-weekly. We had bi-weekly meetings that were 2 hours long. So these people have poured a lot of time into this program. They've helped guide a lot of our decisions. And I can talk also, all those meetings are public. They're all published on our website, all the agendas, notes, everything. Every decision that we've made with them is public information. So the idea of transparency, as Tara touched on, was a really big deal for us too. And then the last thing I sort of want to touch on is some other programs that we're standing up to really help building owners comply. Because I think the ethos that we've sort of operated on from the beginning, and Tara again touched on this, is sure, building owners coming to us and saying, sure, we'll do this, but you need to help us, right? We need money and we need technical assistance, right? And particularly our affordable housing sector, we have built in a lot of flexibility for compliance for affordable housing. I'll touch on one thing that I think is important to point out is our compliance cycles are every 5 years, right? Affordable housing financing cycles do not work on a 5-year period, right? Particularly, their access to capital and their access to financing is typically a 15-year period, right? Or 15 to 20-year period. So when you're telling an affordable housing building that they have to do these retrofits and they have to look every 5 years to try to figure out what to do, and they don't have access to cheap capital like a market rate building would have, it becomes a big challenge, right? And so our engagement with the affordable housing sector started way back in the summer of 2019. And we had sort of a separate working group to talk to a group of affordable housing advocates and building owners to say, we know that you have unique challenges. What are those unique challenges and how can we address them, right? And again, one of them was that financing cycles issue. One of them was just the complexity of trying to upgrade a building without trying to displace tenants, right? I mean, that's a big issue. Another issue is that the building owner doesn't necessarily have a lot of control over the energy usage in that building because the residents are all separately metered. They're consuming energy. We're not here to tell unit A that they can't, they got to turn all their lights off. That's not what we're here to do. So it's really, really tricky. And so we started engaging very early on with this sector. And then lo and behold, and then out of that, we had the National Housing Trust, which is one of our partners here in the district, come out with a set of recommendations of like, this is what the city should be doing, right, to help affordable housing comply. And lo and behold, American Rescue Plan Act comes around because we're thinking we want to do all these things. We don't have the money right now to do this, but we're going to try to do as much as we can, right? American Rescue Plan Act came along just at the right time. And so last year we put in a proposal to the mayor's office to put some of the ARPA funding towards our program. We were given $35 million just this fiscal year to help stand up what we're calling our Affordable Housing Retrofit Accelerator. And basically what the Retrofit Accelerator does is it sort of brings together a lot of different entities we have here in the district to offer resources and kind of coach building owners through the process. So we have our DC Sustainable Energy Utility, which is a third-party contract administrator. They handle all of the efficiency rebate programs here in the district. And then we have a DC Green Bank that was set up several years ago to help offer flexible financing options to building owners that are looking to do these retrofits. And so through the Affordable Housing Retrofit Accelerator, we're focusing on affordable housing buildings that do not meet the BEPS. And we're going to basically take them through the process of step A to step Z, getting them in compliance and sort of making upgrades in their buildings. What it starts with is every building owner is going to get a free energy audit. So anybody who is in this program is going to get a free energy audit. Coming out of that energy audit, we will then look at the measures that have been recommended, and we can give them a sense of, okay, what can we fund directly through the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, like what money can we put towards your building to do these upgrades? And then past that, we're going to pass you on to the DC Green Bank, who will help you figure out the financing for maybe the deeper energy retrofits. So we're really excited about this. There's a link at the bottom of the page. You can check out a little bit more about it. I'm happy to talk more about it as well. And that's it.
Wow, thank you so much, all three of you. This was a phenomenal conversation, and there's been a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A. Every time I forget to ask to see if other panelists, other attendees can see questions from other folks, but definitely elevate the questions that you liked most. I see that Julie was hyping on Signy's question. So it seems to be there's a lot of questions about the nuts and bolts of all this. And before we get in, we talked about 3 distinct conversations. Let's just synopsize this one more time on the why of it all, and then let's get into the nitty-gritties of it all. So why is a BPS one of the most effective tools municipalities can use to drive down energy and carbon use in the built environment? Tara, we'll start with you and then we'll continue on.
So we think building performance standards is a great way to effectively drive down carbons, because you're setting that future goal. Like, how are you going to go on a journey unless you know what your destination is? This is your destination. Katie, I see you unmuted. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Oh, I just unmuted in case somebody threw me a question, but I didn't do it. I can talk a little bit about.
Go ahead.
Tara, I mean, you pointed this out in your presentation about the benchmarking and disclosure laws. Like, you know, they have made a bit of an impact, right? Because, and that we've seen that in DC, maybe a 5% reduction over a 5-year period, right? But that's not going to get us to our goals. And so, like you said, the BPS really sets out clear goals to building owners of this is what we're looking for, and this is what you need to be planning for. And I think here in DC, it's really changed the conversation, right? Particularly when it becomes law, right? Because then it's like they can't, there's not a lot of talk of we're not going to do this. Well, there might be, who knows? There's more talk of how are we going to do it, right? And telling the city, this is what we need for you to give us so that we can do this, right?
The how, especially. It seems like you had mentioned, Katie, like this is the what and this is the how. And we also have a few conversations on the who. And so can we talk a little bit about equity in this? There was a question about how DC is handling the redlined areas, and how can a commercial BPS support racial equity in the full encompassing approach of it all? Let's start with Katie, and then I'll move on to Ben and Tara.
So I think our approach from the beginning has been that we don't want our program to exacerbate housing conditions across the district, right? Disparate housing conditions. And if we were to go take the approach of telling affordable housing buildings, you just don't have to do this, right? What kind of outcome does that provide at the end of the day, right? You have buildings that then are getting invested in and upgraded, and then you have other buildings that aren't. And frankly, affordable housing residents and tenants stand to benefit from this program as well, right? Depending, I know there's the whole idea of split incentives, and that is a whole nother level of complexity. But there's the idea that they're going to have healthier, higher performing buildings with potentially lower energy utility bills, right? With lower utility bills. And so we have stood very strong in that we don't feel that we should set lower standards for our affordable housing properties than our market rate buildings. That, you know, residents that live in those buildings deserve to have higher performing buildings as well. And often here in the district, we hold our affordable housing buildings to higher standards. So for on the new construction side, we often hold them to higher standards because of that reason, because we know there's the idea that folks are going to be burdened by having an unhealthy building, living in an unhealthy building, right? Or a building where their electricity bills are just way too high, right? And so that's sort of how we've approached this is we're not going to hold them to different standards. We're just going to create flexibility and funding and financing and technical assistance to help them get there.
Thanks, Sarah. Can anybody speak to diverse economic inclusion in the solutions of BPS?
Build a little bit more on what
Yeah.
Katie said. It might not get exactly on at what you're trying for, Gillian. So I guess to hark back to the previous question, the major downside of the St. Paul policy is it doesn't get at all buildings. That said, a lot of the policies have been discussed, especially in the last decade or so, have at least the conversation come up to exclude affordable housing. Which harks back to the point Katie brought up, but they have way more complex financing structures that don't necessarily lend themselves to the same types of policies that work for market rate. One really good thing about the St. Paul policy is that, similar to DC, is that affordable housing in the city of St. Paul is often built to a higher standard than a kind of market rate baseline code building, which I think, at least to a certain extent, flips the dialogue, is that no, we should be building these better, not worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Economic inclusion is a big opportunity because there is going to be a workforce that needs to upgrade, that needs to manage these buildings. Part of the getting to this efficiency is managing your building on a day-to-day, weekly basis, right? I want to give a shout out to Emerald Cities Collaborative. They are an organization, a nonprofit organization that has been working on economic inclusion for decades, and they have great resources, best practices, and best methods of how this can be done. I think it is an integration. It's understanding what your workforce strengths are today, who are the people in your local area that are training your workforce, who's a leader in supporting their own workforce and managing them, and integrating these best practices for an inclusive workforce.
Yeah, Tara, I'm glad you mentioned them because I was going to bring up Emerald Cities. They actually, through the American Cities Climate Challenge, they did an analysis, a workforce analysis for us last year on BEPS to sort of say that, as Tara mentioned, like what does the workforce landscape look like now, and what does it need to look like in order, you know, how many jobs is this going to create or are required to get there, right? And then right now we're working with them on developing a framework, a training framework of specifically focused on getting minority owns contractors and minority contractors sort of make sure that they have access to this market. Because the great thing that a lot of the, at least the unions and the building trades folks like about this, we know exactly what buildings need to be upgraded, right? So they know exactly that there is a pipeline. We know who the pipeline is, and we just need to make sure that the connection is there and that we're creating this framework that will, like you said, economic inclusion, ensure that we are training the proper workforce and making sure that everybody has access to that training program so that they can get access to this pipeline of projects. And so I think that's really important piece too. And I wish we had been working on it sooner. I'll say that as a lesson learned.
Thank you. Thank you. And so to bridge off of that, it seems like there's a lot of stakeholders that are helping the building owners meet these targets set by the municipalities. So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between building innovation hubs and cities, and what other stakeholders are engaging in this process, and what role do hubs offer to supporting buildings and portfolio managers during compliance?
I can talk about our Building Innovation Hub, which is run through IMT. So our Building Innovation Hub was stood up. They are a grantee to the district. So right now we are funding them to provide, just sort of be a hub of resources to building owners, not just about BPS, but about all of the policies in the district that are going to kind of affect them. And right now they're building on a lot of really specific tools and resources for building owners. They're about to launch some very specific success with BEPS tools in the next couple of weeks. that are basically going to take, and what we've sort of worked with them on is we want you to be able to take a building owner from A to Z on this process and help them. And so what they've done a really good job of is kind of talking to us and saying, okay, this is what we understand the requirements to be. Let us go talk to the private sector and make sure that they understand it, figure out what their challenges are, and then we'll come back to you. And so it's sort of this feedback loop that we've created with them.
I will say that in some other areas, so Katie, that is a great call out of opportunities to start earlier is economic inclusion. Some cities and communities started with innovation hubs to start making those connections before they started policy, because in that community it was really important to have the experts connected and also the experts connecting with those that weren't necessarily experts in building performance to understand where the gap is already before they go into the policymaking. It's not meant for everyone, but that I just wanted to share a different way that some cities are going about this work.
I think that's important, Sarah. One of the ways we were able to stand up the Affordable Housing Retrofit Accelerator so quickly is that we already had those entities in place. We already had a DCSEU, we already had a DC Green Bank. You know, if we had to start from scratch, we wouldn't be where we are right now. So I agree with that comment, Sarah, for sure.
Thank you. Ben, anything to add? Yeah, sure thing. And so one of the questions that we have here in the Q&A is, what kind of changes in public perception and action have you seen implementing the practices in all, in DC and as well as in St. Paul and the rest of the cities that we're working with through IMT-JERA? How do people engage with this now that this is becoming more commonplace?
I'm going to hand it off to Ben to talk about St. Paul first and how are buildings being designed differently because of this?
Sure. I think that, I mean, we're seeing now that the St. Paul policy was really kind of leading the way 12 or so years ago, and now it's being definitely overshadowed by some more progressive policies elsewhere in the country. That said, I think that the folks that work in St. Paul, the major developers, are very familiar with kind of how to meet these policies, which is kind of puts them at an advantage, I think, to work in other places, or when we talk about major developments like the Highland Bridge project, where there's going to be acres and acres developed to this standard, that there was a lot of a learning time, and especially with the SV 2030's ability to, or policies structure where it steps down over time, there was kind of a learning curve built in that has been helpful. Not sure if that exactly answers the question, but I'll give others a shot.
I will also say changes that we've seen. I think Katie talked about how the conversations flipped to what's possible and how do we get it done instead of it can't be done or only in certain places. It's like, okay, we have that goal. What is our journey? And so it's really flipped the conversation. Someone asked about the cost to comply and whether the retrofits or the cost to comply is higher. And so now they're going to retrofits. So I will say, one, compliance is going to be based on what you determine locally. And so that conversation is going to look different in every locality. But for instance, in New York, we're hearing from building owners that the cost to pay out the compliance fee is too high. And so they are focusing on what is the cost to do these deeper retrofits. And they're having to expand what their ROI is on some of these investments versus like before they might have only asked. So I can speak to, I used to work in a suburb of Minnesota right after the 2008 downturn. And right after that, property owners or property managers told me my property owner is only willing to do things with a 1 to 3 year payback. And even 8 years after that, when things were recovering, they were still only willing to do that. They were setting these really short ROIs. And with this type of long-term goal, it allows property managers that opportunity to go to a property owner and say, like, I need to expand the ROI because I have this long-term goal, and we need to make investments that are going to last longer. It's going to take a larger investment, but they will last, and they're meeting this new goal. So that's another thing that I've seen change in the market because of these. And it actually helps property managers don't want to say this because it puts them at odds with their client, but it helps property managers, particularly those ones that want to make good investments in the buildings because they're proud to like operate a really good building, and maybe their owner hasn't wanted to, maybe they haven't done these types of retrofits. They see it as risky because they haven't been in it. So it's allowing more owners to come into this market, take these actions, and recognize that it does add value to their buildings.
And actually, on that note, I've heard from building owners before that, well, our utilities are going to clean up their grid anyway. So if I just wait for the electricity to be cleaner, why do I need to change the way I operate my building? And that's a very valid question, especially to folks who are just getting involved with energy. So could you talk about that a little bit? It seems like everyone has had that conversation at one point in their career.
Yeah, so there's still, the challenge is the reliability of the grid.
Mm.
And if we're wasting a lot of energy, and we know we're already seeing more extreme weather, in the future, we'll continue to see more extreme weather. That means on the hotter days, there's going to be more requests for a load on the grid. And even on the lower days, like you saw in Texas. So if we aren't making our buildings more efficient and really understanding the capacity they need, it's going to make the grid less reliable, because all of these buildings are connected to the grid, and we need that grid to be reliable for all community members.
Thank you, Tara.
To build on that too, I guess I'll just add that especially in the Midwest, the grid is not getting clean enough to prevent what we're the kind of most disastrous effects of climate change either. So we need to use the like two-pronged tool of efficiency, get the buildings as efficient as possible, and clean the grid. So buildings can really operate as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, I mean, in DC, we have the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act requires 100% renewable portfolio standard of our electricity provider by 2032. So like we definitely had that conversation. I would say that's a really expensive way to go about this, right? Decarbonizing. It is. I mean, that's a lot, just saying, hey, I've slap a bunch of solar on my building and I'll just sit back and wait. Like that's, you're losing a lot of opportunity, as Tara mentioned. And B, the grid cannot handle that load, right? We know right now the grid cannot handle, if we were to electrify every single building in the district, which is our goal, right, is electrification, the grid wouldn't be able to handle it, right? And so we have to do load reduction first, and then and not first, it's like a first / concurrently, right? Yeah. Looking at electrification. Yeah. And we have a whole electrification study here in the district looking at this, and when is that flip point of when it, it will become cheaper, because I know that natural gas is cheaper right now, oftentimes, right? And it's cheaper to just stick with gas appliances or, equipment. But at some point that is not going to be the case. And we really need to be pushing buildings over into like those longer term goals.
Mm-hmm. Phenomenal answers, y'all. And that suits well to what the E.H.Zero program is all about, honestly. And with the robust questions we've had, thank you folks for answering them over here in the answer Q&A. If anybody on the chat has other questions, go ahead and submit them anyway. We'll be able to follow up with you on the questions. I'm gonna wrap it up with just the last two questions that I see here. I see, Terry, you're typing the answer to Julie, but thank you to Keith. How are building owners and stakeholders engaged in this process? And do they have the opportunity to participate in or influence the development of benchmarks and performance tracking tools. Ben and Katie, having gone through this process, Tara, having also gone through this process too, I'm sure that you can relate to this question.
Yeah, so with our benchmarking program, I was not there when this all happened, but from what I understand, there was a lot of engagement going on with building owners. And one of the reasons we picked Energy Star Portfolio Manager at the time is that a lot of buildings were already using it, right? They were already using that tool in the district. And there also isn't like a great alternative to benchmarking right now. But at the time, this is 2010, something like that. This was a new thing. Like the benchmarking laws were not a thing in the country. And so that was one thing. And then I would say with the BEPS program, through Clean Energy DC, we've done a lot of engagement with building owners and I'll say industry associations. So we have a association here called AOBA, which is like our local BOMA. So we engage with them a lot. I just emailed them 3 times this week. Like we talk to them a lot because that's a way to reach a lot of building owners. And then our task force actually has, I think, 3 building owner reps on it, or 4 building owner reps on it. So they were heavily involved in the implementation plan that we built out for our BPS. That's kind of how we've done it. I will say this, the thing that I wish, again, we were doing better at is reaching building owners that are harder to reach, that aren't a part of industry associations, that maybe don't have a property management company, that don't have a consultant. And I think that is something that we need to work on more here, because those are the folks that need the most help. Definitely as we drop down in square footage, I know that's going to become a bigger problem.
Absolutely. And for folks in Grand Rapids who want to participate in this process, right now we're in the education side of it to talk about what possibly is being considered for Grand Rapids. And then we're going to go into the engagement side. But right now you have the opportunity to engage. For example, these webinars are a way to talk about these topics individually, but we also are meeting people at their own connections. For example, we've met with BOMA, IFMA, other forums to speak about what this means and how you can engage in it. I'm sure everyone by now knows our wonderful Wendy Berg will be sending a follow-up email with the presentations and with the recording. And that also will include a survey to hear your feedback and what more deep dives do you want to go into. And from what you see now, what are your concerns? What are your questions? What are you excited about? So for folks, I'll be able to put my email in the chat. You can talk to me directly and respond to what we will be sending you out shortly with this presentation. So folks, to wrap it up, final thoughts. So what do you see on the horizons for BPS? Tara, Ben, we'll start with you.
So I'm excited to see this dual equity and performance goals start from the beginning, because I think that will provide a real value to the community and healthier buildings for all.
That's a good one. I don't know if I can top that. I think it's exciting to see policies that have been based at the city prove success stories that could potentially be adopted at the state level.
Absolutely. It seems like this, the cities do lead the nation, and the cities lean on each other, like right now. Thank you. And we also lean on thought leaders like IMT, NNBI, RMI, so much more. So thank you sincerely, speakers, for speaking with us today. We hope to follow in your footsteps in some way or another. And thank you to everyone who's been online. Thank you, James. Do connect back with us. My name is, well, you all know my name, but I'm Gillian at usgbcwm.org. Don't be shy. I'm not a stranger. And we'll be connecting shortly. And do connect with us for the next session in 2 weeks from now, Thursday, same time, to talk about point of sale and point of lease. So thank you very much, folks. Have a lovely day. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.